Agape is the essence of New Testament ethic. Agape is the way to eternal salvation, the way to God. Agape is God. To grow in agape is to grow into God. Last lecture, we talked about two distinct dimensions of agape that are discussed in the New Testament. Namely, agape in general means unconditional care. Its two New Testament dimensions, the willingness to suffer without the desire for retaliation, another name for forgiveness, and the willingness to serve without the desire for reciprocation, another way of talking about the suffering servant concept in the New Testament, that these are the ways, or this is the way, agape, to reconciliation. That is, the reconciliation between man and God and man and man. When we talk about, first of all, the willingness to suffer without the desire for retaliation, it would probably be good to discuss this in terms of the rejection of violence in human affairs, the giving up of the protection of violence in human affairs, quite specifically. Forgiveness. Forgiveness means that somehow I suffer and I do not retaliate and I do not desire to retaliate. Basically, that's a general kind of approach to the idea of forgiveness. It's not a magical process. It's a process that takes place here and now between people, between persons, human and divine. Forgiveness. Forgiveness is, as is agape. Agape is the way of overcoming evil. Forgiveness is the way of overcoming evil. Consider. Here's the situation. Here's X, and here's Y. Now, X and Y, like you and I, have in them, coming to any given moment in time, both good and evil. Both good and evil. They have a chain of good, if you will, that is part of their individual histories, that comes to them moment to moment to moment. All right. Good and evil into the universe, not like rain, not by some process of osmosis, good and evil into the universe only by people bringing them into the universe. Stronger yet, since I am a unique person, and no person can ever occupy the place in time and space that I occupy, moment in and moment out, if good and evil are put into the universe at that place in time, it's only because I put them there. No one else can put them there. Now here's our friends X and Y, and they come to a moment in time, and we'll freeze that moment in time. Now let us say that X hurts Y. All right? Now Y, being hurt, he retaliates. He hurts X. He's doubled. Now we've doubled the evil in the universe here at this little moment in time and space. X being hurt retaliates against Y. Y being hurt now retaliates against X, and so it goes. No peace, no reconciliation. Let's say that this time X hurts Y to the point that Y can't retaliate any longer. Is that peace? Is that reconciliation? No, that's only victory. The Christian approach to this situation is this chain of evil that comes to X at this moment in time, he incarnates that chain and he prosecutes evil on Y. The Christian approach is, at this point here, Y does not return evil for evil. Y stops the chain dead by not returning evil for evil. This chain that has come down through X to this moment in time, which X is incarnated, Y stops the chain dead right there. He overcomes the evil by stopping it, by refusing to continue it, by refusing to place it in the universe where only he could place it. Therefore, all of this doesn't exist. But the Christian approach to overcoming evil is something stronger than and something far greater than simply not returning evil for evil. The Christian approach specifically, explicitly, is to return good for evil. When this chain of evil comes down to X, and X incarnates the evil and tries to hurt Y or hurts Y, and Y does not respond in kind, fine, he does not respond to evil with evil. But now, as a Christian, it's Y's obligation to incarnate the chain of good that's come down to him and to respond to X with good. To return good for evil. A far more difficult thing. Extraordinarily difficult. How many shows have you ever seen on television? How many shows have you ever heard on radio? How many people in school, teachers and so forth? How much discussion, dialogue, reflection have you ever heard on returning good for evil? And yet, it is as fundamental to Christianity as the cross itself. That is precisely what Jesus did on the cross. Jesus returned good for evil. He did not just absorb evil. He did not just lie there on the piece of wood and return and do nothing. The returning of good for evil is a positive choice of means in the human context. It is not quietism. It is not passivism, P-A-S-S-I-V-E. It is a choice of positive, concrete, dynamic means. To return good for evil is always possible. There is never an occasion when you cannot return good for evil. There is an entire tradition of spirituality in Eastern Catholic and Orthodox dimensions of Christianity that makes the point that the first step, and the first step may be the only step available to a person in returning good for evil, but a necessary step, is to do precisely in the first instance what Jesus did on the cross, namely what? A man nailed to the cross, being tortured, dying, helpless, was still able to return good for evil. How? By forgiving those who were causing his suffering, by not retaliating, by praying for them. By praying for them. If we can do nothing else, we can pray for the person who is injuring us or who has injured us. The psychological and spiritual facts of the matter are, of course, it is difficult to build up, maintain, sustain the hate of retaliation, of humiliation, or what have you, that comes from being hurt, and pray for the person at the same time. Prayer is a cleansing effect. It may be the only step that you have available to you under some circumstances, e.g., when someone dashes in front of you and cuts you off in a car. It may be the only step. You can't get out and talk or say or do anything to the person, but it is a positive step. It is something that can be done. Now, of course, clearly, under most circumstances or many circumstances, one can go beyond prayer. One can reconcile the situation by returning good to the person who's doing him evil. Not once, not twice, but over and over and over. Forgiveness, the willingness to suffer without the desire for retaliation, means more than simply not responding to evil with evil. It means returning good for evil. Now, if we can take a look at this chart here, I think it will be helpful. Schematically, in terms of just symbolic ethics related to no particular ethical system, there are 4 and only 4 options available ethically to a human being. The 4 options are these. If I do good to you, you do good to me. Fair enough. All ethical systems agree with that. If I do evil to you, you do evil to me. Fair enough. An eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Old Testament, what the people of the Old Testament thought was what God expected of man. If I do good to you, you do evil to me. No one accepts that. That's totally unacceptable, unfair, unjust. If I do evil to you, you do good to me. It's at this point here, and at only this point, in terms of symbolic ethics, that Christianity has anything unique to say. The returning of good for evil. All right. How much of what we are taught by word and by deed through the various institutions of family, church, state, military, television, schools, Catholic, Protestant, or otherwise, public, how much of what's taught is in fact the returning of evil for evil? Under the name of justice, under the name of my rights. But it is not agape. It is not loving. It is not caring. It is not being concerned for people who are hurting you. Unconditional care means that I care for a person. I care for a person regardless of any conditions. One of those conditions could be that that person has hurt or will hurt me or is hurting me. As we go to the second dimension of agape, namely the willingness to serve without the desire for reciprocation. The willingness to serve without the desire for reciprocation. This is a general way of talking about the concept, the central concept, a central concept in the New Testament called the suffering servant. As you know, the suffering servant is that person out of the Old Testament. It may be a person, it may be a community, it may be a corporate personality. The suffering servant is that entity out of the Old Testament, rather, and Deutero-Isaiah, who suffers innocently, and by his suffering, other people are saved. Those who are afflicted are somehow saved, their affliction is somehow removed. Now, the suffering servant concept, Mackenzie says in his Power and Wisdom, is central to the understanding of what Jesus is talking about in the New Testament. He says, as we'll see later, that the suffering servant is so intimately a part of the New Testament that if it is not the work of Jesus himself, then we know nothing of Jesus' work and his person. That is, it is not the work of the early community. It is Jesus' way of identifying himself and his mission as suffering servant. What is the concept and what does it mean? It is not a magical concept. It is not a magical concept. It is a way, a psychological, spiritual, human way of approaching human existence. It is unconditional care. It is something that is simply, normally, totally different from the way we act. Let me give you an example, or a series of examples. Suppose you're riding down the street, and you see a funeral, and you look at the hearse, and you see the car in back of the hearse with the family. We, as human beings, have a capacity for compassion. We can look into that car in back of the hearse, and we can allow the suffering of those people into our presence. We can know what the kinds of thoughts are. Perhaps thoughts like, will we ever see him again? Will we ever know him again? Will he ever be again? I wish I had done that. If only we had done this. I wish I had said that, and so forth. We can know that. We can allow that suffering into our presence. The problem is that when we do allow suffering into our presence, we too suffer. It upsets the normal. If we are thinking about the Boston Bruins, if we're thinking about any sort of thing that's pleasant, and we allow suffering into our presence, we suffer. It necessarily means we suffer. The single best example, of course the opposite, I should say, of suffering servant, of allowing suffering into our presence, is indifference of conscience, or hardness of heart, rather. They both mean the same thing. It means simply looking at people as objects and ignoring that they're suffering. The single best example of suffering servant that I know of is in a book called The Last of the Just by a man by the name of Andrei Schwartzbach. The just man legend or tradition in Judaism extends from the idea of the servant of the Lord or the suffering servant in the Old Testament. The legend is that there are 36 suffering servants in the world at all times who take so much suffering on themselves that the rest of the world can survive. Now, Schwartzbach in this novel talks about, first of all, the history of a family of suffering servants, if you will, a lineage of suffering servants. And he traces this lineage down to a man by the name of Ernie Levy, who in the 1930s is about to marry a girl by the name of Golda. Now, Golda and Ernie are about to get married when the Nazis take over the city. They're separated, and they go through, Ernie goes through, a series of humiliations, of pains, of sufferings, of all that you saw in Night and Fog, the boxcars. It's hard to realize, for example, that people were in those boxcars for 10 days and 2 weeks without toilet facilities, without any way to sit down or stand up, with people dying, vomiting, rotting. And they lived that way. Madness, death, rape, masochism, sadism, everything that could possibly take place in that kind of situation did. Ernie lives through all this. He lives through the concentration camp experiences. Finally, he's too weak to be considered a worker anymore, and he's shipped off to one of the camps with the cremation ovens. Ernie knows from before the time he got married that he was in the suffering servant tradition, rather the just man tradition. He's been told about the just man tradition. People have hinted that he's a just man. He doesn't believe it. He didn't believe it then, and he doesn't believe it now. He's shipped off to be cremated. He is now an atheist. All he wants to do is die. There's no meaning in human existence. He's going to die like the ant. He's going to be food for worms forever. He gets in, he's in the boxcar, and who does he meet on top of all those other sufferings but Golda, who is also being shipped to die? Golda brings back that kind of suffering that's just intolerable, the suffering of what might have been. Ernie and Golda, as you saw in the movie, were sent to the right to die. They're in a group of a couple of hundred people, all naked, as was the case. They are all pushed in to that shower room with the big steel door that you saw in the Night and Fog movie. They're crowded in there. Half of them, at least half of them are children, because children are unproductive. They're not useful. They're all pushed in there. Children are clawing at his leg and so forth and so on. Ernie just wants to die. He wants it over with. He wants to be free of the pain. They're all crowded into that shower room, and that steel door is slammed shut. And it's slammed shut, and the clank and the darkness come at the same time. And the children start to screech. Now, Schwarzbach lived through the concentration camp experience. The children start to screech. They're clawing at Ernie's legs. They become terrified. They flip back, one right after another, kind of in unison as these things will happen, and begin to scream, "Mommy, Mommy, Mommy, I won't do it again. Let me out. I'm sorry, I'm sorry." They are absolutely terrified. The gas is turned on. There's only a minute to live, 50 seconds, 70 seconds to live. Ernie hears the screeching. He hears the agony of the children. Certainly he has his own problems. It's only going to be a minute anyway. He bends down and he begins to tell the children, breathing in the gas, which makes him suffer, he begins to tell the children the story about the Messianic banquet. Telling them, now in a minute we're all going to be with God, and Mommy and Daddy are going to be there, and there's going to be green grass and blue skies and beautiful fields, and God's going to be there, and there's the tables going to be loaded with grapes, and on and on and on. And the children listen and they quiet down. He's telling them to take deep breaths because that will help them die faster and with less pain. All the time it is killing him. He doesn't believe it. He's suffering just talking. But he's telling them to make death easier for them. He continues to tell them the story. They die, and he dies. That is the single best example in literature that I know of what the suffering servant concept is all about, psychologically, spiritually, and morally. One will never have either the urgency nor the creativity to do anything about human suffering unless one is willing to allow suffering into his presence. Unless one is willing to live not just with the question of suffering, but going back to our first lecture, with the real, concrete, existential problem of suffering. Unless a person allows suffering into his presence, he will not have the urgency nor the creativity to respond to human suffering. He'll do nothing. Seymour Wilde, a Jewish philosopher who became a Christian, makes the point that it is self-evident that men are born into not rights, but into the obligation to respond to human suffering. That is what life is all about. The obligation to respond to human suffering. If the Samaritan walking down the road did not let suffering into his presence, he never would have helped the Jewish person. Compassion is essential. Common passion. It seems to me that hardness of heart, indifference of conscience, just the opposite of what agape, the willingness to serve without the desire for reciprocation, the willingness to serve just because people are in need, expecting nothing back. As Ernie Levy expected nothing from the children, they were going to die in less than a minute. All he could do was make the dying a little bit easier, and no one would ever know about it. In some concentration camps, people were killed at the rate of 15,000 a day, and when they opened up the camps, there were less than 50 people left. It's to serve without the need for reciprocation, the desire for reciprocation, to serve only because there's a need. John L. Mackenzie writes on the suffering servant in his interpretation of the New Testament. He says, starting the discussion, this passage, namely the suffering servant passage in the Old Testament, describes a person of unknown identity who suffers on behalf of others, although he himself is innocent. And by his suffering, those for whom he suffers are relieved from affliction. Both for Jews and Greeks, the proclamation of the suffering servant was a negation of their highest values. To the Jew, it was an annihilation of the King Messiah and the political messianic reign. To the Greek, it was a denial of the value of the mind and courage on which Greek ethics reposed. The early church attributes the proclamation of this theme to Jesus himself, and no convincing reason has been urged to show that it should be attributed to another. It is as deeply embedded in the gospel as anything. To repeat what we have said in another connection, if this theme is not the work of Jesus himself, then we know nothing of his words or his person. When we meet the theme of the suffering servant as proclaimed in the New Testament, we are at the very center of the Christian revolution. As the suffering servant, now listen to this, as the suffering servant, Jesus experienced nothing which is not part of the human condition, and he thus placed his achievement within the reach of all men. Those who identify with him cannot share in his divine sonship except by adoption, but they can share in the human condition. Suffering and death are the normal of the human condition. Jesus does not ennoble them, but he makes them the means by which man is liberated from sin and death. Those who accept the human condition with him share in the redemptive act, the saving act of God. He demands nothing that is not within the reach of every man. The ultimate futility in life of unbelieving and hopeless man become the very means of ultimate fulfillment of human potential. Deliverance of man is not to be accomplished by an act which can be shared in by only a few. Mere cultivation of pain does not assure identity with Jesus as suffering servant. We speak of suffering and death because they are the concrete manifestations of the power of evil. We see that Jesus does not make these irrational elements. He does make them the means of conquering evil and death. We must point out again that mere animal pain does not save. Identity with Jesus' suffering is first of all identity with Jesus' loving. So with that, we'll conclude.